Really nice. Who's going to show up? But a lot of people did, so thank you for doing that. Awesome being here with you. This is great.
This is so fun.
We have had a lot of conversations, never in front of people before.
No.
So that's a new experience, but we've known each other for like 25 years, I think, and change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Since the late 90s, we're both from Wisconsin. I got to know you because I went to college with your brother Joe, who inspired at least one story in your great short story collection, Camera Lake. Maybe we could talk about that here in a minute. We're two very different writers. What you do is very difficult. You're a fiction writer. I'm a rock critic, so I just listen to music and I write about it. Very easy job that I tricked people into paying me to do, so I appreciate that. But one thing I think about when I look at the books that we both have written, you wrote a great novel called The Restaurant Inspector before this short story collection, is that I think that like where we come from plays a large role in what we write about. Coming from the Midwest, Middle America, Upper Midwest, Wisconsin, definitely informs the characters that you've written about, the stories you've written about. The word heartland is literally in the title of my latest book. I've written a lot of Midwest stuff. I know like why that's important for me as a writer, but I'm curious for you. We've never really talked about this. Why is that something that you're attracted to, writing about Midwesterners and all their weirdness? And has moving away, because you live in London now, has that altered your point of view on where you come from at all?
Yeah, I mean, first let me say right back at you. This is like, we're really thrilled to do this event together because this is just what we do. And this, allowed me to drive 7 hours up here to hang out.
Flying across the ocean and all that stuff.
And you grew up in Appleton, which is what, a mid-sized city?
Yeah.
You'd say? And I grew up in
70,000?
Yeah, and I grew up in small town. Like
Yeah.
2,680 was Neillsville. That's like central northern Wisconsin, and Milton was 4,444. I saw it moved over 5,000, and it's not all the same number now. But in terms of how that orients the stories and what I'm interested in with like heartland narratives, Midwest narratives, I also want to ask if heartland is Midwest, but we can get to that.
Yeah.
Because I've never felt like I was a part of it because we moved around. Like my cousins here, our families come from like Iowa, and all my two brothers were born in different states. They were born in Arizona, Iowa. I was born in Wisconsin, but we moved around so much. There's never really any roots, like, because when you get in small towns, it's not about a state.
Yeah.
It's about if you have roots in that town, and I've never felt rooted in a place. And so I think a lot of my characters are figuring out their place in the world. There's a lot of restlessness. There's people who would come from elsewhere and come in. In the novel, it was mostly about the main character, at least the through line character, came from like out east and was just never a part of things, and that kind of explores who's in and who's out of a small town in the Midwest. And so I think that definitely like provided my viewpoint and how I entered into the stories and the characters more than the stories. But like, and I don't consciously have that be my point when I'm writing or what I want the stories to be about. But it comes out, and then I think moving to London is like this extra layer of perspective, and I can really look at it from like high up, and I can see. And I think when I was writing, I would write about characters who don't know what they want, maybe. But I think when I was writing it originally, because the stories have been over like 10 years, I guess, but after the book got accepted, I had months to revise, and I extensively revised these stories over the years, and especially over the 6 months. And I think being in London, plus just having that time, that distance in time, but like I know what the characters want now, and I know what they're looking for, even if they don't, and if I didn't when I was writing it. So I was able to revise it to where at least I had that knowledge of what they were looking for, even if I don't put it in there still, like I could revise it so that it was clear to me when I reread it. You know what I mean? And I think that I love having, I put all these stories in the Midwest, or people in the Midwest who left, because I like that rootedness. I want something to orient these characters, even if they can't orient themselves, you know what I mean? And the Midwest is just a perfect place for that, because nobody's sure of themselves or something, but everybody's comfortable. It's all about comfort, but nobody's actually comfortable, I don't think. Not nobody, but a lot of people are not very comfortable, even though, because you don't express your emotions, at least when we were growing up.
Yeah.
It was like, no emotions, you don't stand out, and people want to get out, like how you're at with Bruce Springsteen. But
Right.
but what about you? I mean,
Yeah.
you stick in heartland narratives too, and this is
Well,
very
yeah,
specific.
sort of. I mean, like for me, like when I got started working in media, and this is still true, I think also, but to a somewhat lesser degree, just because media is breaking down, it's in a long process of kind of being decentralized. But like when I got started, it was all about New York, and to a lesser degree, Los Angeles, and I didn't live in either one of those cities, and a lot of the writing was from the perspective of people that were like behind the velvet rope, very cool New York type writers writing about bands, and you just felt, as I did, living in the middle of the country, that you were locked out of that. And at some point you stop wishing that you were one of those people, and you start to realize that, like me being on the outside is kind of an advantage in a way. I can own who I am and have a different perspective as someone who's proudly Midwestern. Like I love living in this part of the country, and again, at that moment in time, I just felt like that point of view maybe wasn't really being represented. So I felt like maybe there was a lane for that. And with this book in particular, writing about Springsteen, the heartland in the title, it's more about the idea of what that is than like a literal, because there is no like literal heartland in the country. It's always been this sort of conception of America that there is like one America, and that if you get past everyone's differences, you can find sort of shared desires and needs and ideologies and things that bond us together. Like that's kind of like one of the central ideas of this country. And one of the things in the book, in addition to just writing about Bruce Springsteen in this record, is kind of exploring that idea and that being a dream that may or may not actually have validity to it.
Do you think it's definable, or do you think it's a feeling?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both.
Or does it break down once you try to define it, and you kind of get to that in the book, where it's like all these things that are supposed to be represented in Heartland Rock or whatever.
Yeah.
You start to pull the strands, and it might not actually exist.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, one thing that I was interested in writing about in the book is the idea of sort of the gap between who Americans actually are and how they see themselves, and how with Bruce Springsteen, there is a little bit of a duality there, where he's always been an artist who's written very evocatively and honestly about the shortcomings of America, but he's also someone who believes in the idea of America, that there is sort of a higher ideal that you can achieve if you can put things aside and all that. So that was something that was really interesting.
Do you think
to
he's
write about.
fundamentally misunderstood? Because tonally, he's like, Born in the USA is this like rocket song that Republicans use, and you do a great job too of like showing like the George Will piece in the Washington Post where he goes to a Bruce Springsteen concert is, I mean, you break down the article really well.
Right.
It's so cringy.
Right.
And it was just like, he's the last person who should be talking about it, but he totally misunderstood what it was.
He misunderstands him, but he's also communicating a pretty common view of Bruce Springsteen, which is that he's this patriotic figure, and that Born in the USA as a song is like a patriotic song. Like even now, 40 years later, there are people who will play that song at political rallies, and they don't really pay attention to the lyrics, which, it's a much more nuanced song than just like the big drums and the synthesizers and all that. And I mean, and it is an interesting thing. It was actually kind of related to something I wanted to ask about your book and your writing, if you notice that segue.
That was awesome.
There.
You're
But
a pro.
one thing that I really like about your stories, and when you write about people from the Midwest, is I feel like a lot of your stories it's about communication, and sort of like the lack of communication or the difficulty of communication, and how there is a disconnect between how people present themselves to the world and how they actually feel, but how a lot of people in this part of the country are able to express how they actually feel through like passive aggressive means. So like they'll say, I'm happy, but you actually know they're not happy by the way that they're acting. I feel like everyone's mother in this room probably acted like that, at least mine was like that, or is like that. I was wondering if you could talk about that, because that seems like, I see that as a through line in a lot of your writing.
Yeah, I think to have that tension as like the main character tension is something I'm interested in exploring. I think
and it's very funny too.
Right.
Because we should say like, we're kind of like talking about your book like it's a serious book. And it is a serious book, but your stories are very funny too. And I think my book is funny too, if I may say, if I may be so bold. There is like humor going on at the same time. I mean, I think I wrote a blurb for you where I said, your books remind me of like the Coens films in a lot of ways, because there is that sort of tragic comic tone to a lot of your stories where you're sort of laughing until you're not laughing anymore, because there's like a sucker punch at the end of the story.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what you're, like the exterior and interior of the character, like how they project themselves and then how they actually feel is kind of tough to keep that tone, right?
Right.
That because I had so an interviewer asked me, he said your novel's really comic, it's like a comic novel, and these are more serious stories, and I was like, they're not serious stories, like I don't want them to be serious stories, they're serious parts, but I think, I don't know, like, and with my novel, I'm like, it's not like a comic novel.
Well, there's a story in your book that I like a lot, and it might be the first story, where it's about this football team, and one of the kids on the team, like his dad texts, "I love you."
The coaches, he gets them. His punishment is that he'll text their dad,
that's right.
"I love you" on their phone.
That's right. This kid on the team, he screws up in practice, so the coach makes him text his dad, "I love you," and his dad actually is pretty moved by this, but then he finds out that it was just a punishment, and he didn't mean it. And there's this chain reaction on the team where it's like fathers and sons, like these kids being like forced to text "I love you" to their dad, and it just the weirdness that creates, like this very basic thing, and that's a very funny story. But there's also something kind of sad and tragic at the bottom of that, about like, how people just can't communicate how they feel to each other.
Yeah, and I always want I want humor to push the stories forward. Like I want that, but I do think that short stories can be like too light. There cannot be much holding them together if they're all humor. Whereas like I think in a book, I think you can keep that going longer in a way for whatever reason, because you can put more heaviness in there. Heaviness probably isn't the right word, but just more like emotion, more serious drama or whatever. But yeah, I would always prefer to be funny. I would always, with that story, I'm just going to add this in.
I feel that way too about humor, because I feel like a lot of music criticism is very dry and very academic. And I feel like, look, there's not a lot of people that want to read music books, so like why punish them, the people who do, by making it really boring and academic? Like I want people to have a good time. I also hope that they get maybe some of the ideas in the book and the points I'm trying to make, but I do want it to feel like, oh, I'm having a good hangout with a buddy and we're talking about this album. It's like a one-sided conversation because I'm doing all the talking, but hopefully that's entertaining and not tedious for the reader. But I just feel like the humor part it's a big part of like what I try to do, because my goal is always like I want the book to feel as fun and exciting as the record I'm writing about, which when you're writing about Bruce Springsteen, that's a pretty lofty goal. I'm not saying I'm as good as Bruce Springsteen with this book. This is not, but that's the goal, and hopefully you can get close enough to that where people enjoy the experience.
But you're also really good, and we've talked before about how when you say what book you're writing next, you don't interview the person. It's not a biography. It's like you're the main character in your
Sort
books.
of, yeah.
And But
very self-absorbed
no,
process.
but it's my favorite. That's like I love your books, even if I'm not a fan of the subject.
Right.
But it also allows you to not pull punches.
Right.
You know, and so like, you put the George Will thing in, and you're just like, it's really funny because like you point out the humor in that, and then you do that throughout the book, and that's my favorite part of reading you is that it's funny, it's light, and it's propulsive, like that kind of like, it's like talking to you at a bar. I know it's like a cliche of writing, but it, you know.
Do you think? I mean, because like your brother's involved in comedy. Like you write comic novels, you write comic stories. I always feel like there's like an element of Midwestern people, like the sense of humor of Midwestern people, and I think it is because you think like when I was growing up, David Letterman was like one of my heroes, and he's from Indiana, and you know Johnny Carson is from Nebraska. Like there is a thing about like a lot of comics coming from the middle of the country. Obviously, there's a lot of comics that come from New York and Los Angeles and all that, but I always felt like there was something about being in a place that's like kind of outside the world a little bit, and it gives you a perspective that allows you to have a sense of humor.
I think it's a combination of like good sense, you know, you have like good sense and you can like pick out the funny parts of other people and things. I also think it's a really good way of masking emotion.
Right.
You know, and like, I mean, our family certainly we don't talk about stuff, you know that.
It's like alcohol and jokes in the Midwest. That's how we...
The alcohol helps you be funny.
Yeah, exactly. Funny drunks everywhere. But yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a big part of your writing. And I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you about, because we never talked about this either really, is, again, like you write fiction and I write nonfiction. I feel like we're both writing a lot about from our own experiences. I feel like my books are pretty personal. I would assume that you think your books are pretty personal in a way, even if you're not writing like autobiographical books. You're still writing things based on things you've observed in your past and all that. I'm always fascinated by fiction writers because that seems so hard to me.
You are fascinating. You are, every time you're just like, how do you do that?
I am, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about process. Because like to me, like to write a novel, I mean, I've written a lot of books, but writing a novel seems impossible to me. And without getting too deep into the weeds, is there like a kind of a succinct way of describing the approach with something like that?
In terms of the personal, I think I feel like, and this I didn't think of this, but like fiction writing like is like either about other books or it's about your experience, right? And I feel like mine does come from experience more. And I think, I don't know, maybe it came at the end of like the group of writers who are, it's like, if you're gonna write, you gotta do stuff. You know, you gotta get out there and ride the rails and know America.
You like lived in Alaska for a while. Like you were doing like some Hemingway type stuff.
I mean, I think it's
I never did any of that. I just stayed in a room listening to records.
But it's also
hitchhiking.
I think it's also like a very like white guy thing where it's like you don't have inherent experience. You have to go out and get it. You know, and like we all know that white guys are the best writers, so like you have to go out, you know, so that's the blanket advice.
No one laughed at that, he was being sarcastic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to be clear.
Yeah, my delivery was...
You gotta be careful.
Nobody laughed, not the actual joke.
I think you need more of a sarcastic delivery. Like, we all know that, yeah, like that. Sold it.
I'm learning. I'm gonna get an email later about this. No, but in terms of how it informs like this collection especially is like, and my cousin's right here, and like at least two of the stories come because our grandfather was a very eccentric, should we call him? Like short, generously eccentric character, and so growing up, like I'd hear stories, and like the first story I wrote, because I stopped writing for a while, and then the first story I wrote was just like putting together as many of those stories as I could into one story about him. But then there's also a couple other stories in there that are like a story I'd hear about like a great aunt, you know, and doing something weird, and then you make a narrative out of it, you know, and then I narrativize that just because it's fodder, but also I think it represents something about people, about the Midwest, about who our family is. But
we should say too, there's a story in there, I think it's called Pharaoh.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Basically, kind of inspired by your brother.
No, it's my grandpa.
Wasn't there a story, I'm mixing up stories, there's a story about a guy who like pays people to
that say stupid things to toll booth attendants.
Right.
Yes, and that's what my brother has done. Yeah, and that's
And it's
another
not just
one
the
where-
toll booth attendants,
No,
it's
no, no.
anybody.
It's anybody, just flight attendants, police officers, hot dog vendors.
And not even money, just like dares.
No, no, no.
Like,
He just
people-
tells you to do it, and then he'll berate you if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very, yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of that coming through. I forget about that story. I dedicated it to him because I stole his idea. So I was like, well, it's an homage. But I also had to endure that. You know, like somebody making me do stupid things my whole
Yeah, I
life.
think he owes you.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely.
One story. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Psychological damage.
and there's also like a lot of like job stuff in there. There's a lot, like I've worked a lot of dumb jobs, and
Right.
and you know that I have to use that for something, and because it wasn't for money or experience that gets me a job now. Like it's never helped me in any material way other than like paying rent.
See, like for me, like I'll just tell the story in my
Yes.
books, and it won't be fictionalized. It'll just be what happened, and hopefully it's delivered in such a way. Because like with my books, I'm usually taking like a bird's eye view of the subject. So like if I'm writing about Bruce Springsteen, I'm also going to write about America. I'm also going to write about like Heartland Rock in 1985. I'm going to write about Paul Schrader's films, you know, John Fogerty, all things that I think link up to Bruce Springsteen, but not just strictly writing about him. And then there's the personal element usually too. Like in the Springsteen book, it opens with me being a little kid and hearing that record for the first time, like discovering the tape in my dad's car and having this experience with the record, and that really being one of the first albums I ever knew was an album. It was that, it was Michael Jackson's Thriller, and it was Sports by Huey Lewis and the News. And we don't need to get into what's the best record out of those three.
Sports.
There you go. I knew we'd have one sports head in the house. If someone wants to argue about if 4 is the better Huey Lewis record, we could talk about that after the talk here. But like for me, like I'm telling that story because I think it's entertaining, but also I feel like there's maybe hopefully some universal element to that, because I think there were a lot of kids probably like that.
The part about because I love the personal, especially your first book, because I heard a lot of those stories. But
Yeah, there's stories in that book I would not put in a book today, probably, because my kids are getting older and I do not want them to read that book. There's like some
yeah,
embarrassing
they're great stories. I couldn't.
They're good
put them
stories
in
though,
there.
yeah.
But like how protective of yourself are you with that? Because like in this
Not
book,
very.
but yeah, because like in this book,
I mean-
like that story's good where you listen to the tape the first time, but then throughout you'll be like I like John Cougar Mellencamp and these people, but probably because I'm searching for a father figure.
Right.
And then that's where we get I feel like that's like where like you get like come to the fore, like
Right,
I get
right.
to know you really.
I mean, I think when you're a writer, if it's good material, you're gonna want to use it. And there's clearly, I mean, there's some things I would never probably write about. Now, maybe I wouldn't even say that. I might feel differently in the future. It's just, I don't know. There's something I think about being a writer where you have to have an element of like, look at me. You know, like every writer I've ever known feels like they're the most egocentric person, and they're also like sort of like the most self-hating person. You know, it's like, I'm the best writer, why is this writer bigger than me? Like, I should be the best or the most successful. And then also like, I'm the worst writer that's ever lived. And it's like, and those two things I think exist at the same time. Like, you need a little bit of that ego to put yourself out there. If you didn't think that you were good, like you could never show your writing to people or try to sell them, like be like, actually buy this book. But then you also have that kind of constant feeling that it's not good enough, and in a way that kind of pushes you forward. Because you feel like, well, maybe I can write something good the next
Do you think
time.
you could dig deeper into yourself if you wrote fiction? Because
you know,
it's not you, but you can get those same
Again,
feelings out.
what you do is such a mystery to me. I could not do it. I don't actually read a lot of fiction either, unfortunately. From the time I was a kid, I was just always drawn to like nonfiction. So like I was reading Jane Austen in school because it was assigned to me, but then I'd go home and read Hammer of the Gods. by Stephen Davis. Just total garbage rock literature. Like that was always like those were my comic books, like rock books.
There's like, because you started writing really young, like for your paper,
right?
Like you had the full like Cameron Crowe, like you were writing.
Well, yeah, but I wasn't hanging out with like Led Zeppelin or anything like that. I was like writing record reviews in Appleton, Wisconsin. But other than that, exactly like Cameron Crowe.
You're my Cameron Crowe.
Yeah, right. Yeah, except for all the great.
You would like read like the Rolling Stone like compendium books when you were a small child, right? That was your bedtime reading. This is why like what you do is a mystery, because the encyclopedic knowledge you have in your brain is like, fiction writers, we don't know anything, like, in a way.
You do though, because I think fiction is sold with the details. And if the details aren't there, yeah, you're making it up.
Yeah, but it's not like details about like Molly Hatchet, like.
I know, but like if you were gonna write a story about a rock band though, you would need to know those details from other rock bands. Just like if I read your book and you're writing about small town Wisconsin and it didn't have the details right, even if like you're making up the details, they still have the ring of truth, like they could be true. So that's where the fiction and nonfiction thing gets blurred a little bit. I think there is like a lot of nonfiction in what you do. The plot is fiction, but like the background is nonfiction. And in a way, it's in the reverse for me, because you can't just like spit out facts when you write a book, especially in this day and age, because everyone has access to Wikipedia. So if you're just going to be reciting facts, that's not really a book. I think what makes it a book is the perspective of the writer, who's going to apply that, like his or her perspective to it, and that becomes the plot. So I guess your plot is fiction and the background is nonfiction. My plot is nonfiction, and maybe the background is kind of me.
You get a thesis to work off of, though. You have an argument driving, like chapters, and then an overarching argument. And I love. There's nothing. If anybody can ever argue with Steve Hyden, it's recommended. Also, you'll get destroyed.
No, you won't. There's a lot. No, that's not true. I guess I'm arguing with you, but arguing with me. But I don't think that's true.
You definitely are on the front foot when you argue. It's all I'll say. But it's super fun.
I don't like to argue though about music.
No, you don't.
I find it very tiresome.
But like condiments of like food.
Well, now we're talking about our text thread, where we just argue about barbecue sauce versus ranch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great meeting of the minds there.
But I love reading your book because it's like I can see your argument style throughout.
Right.
Like every point, I can be like, "Oh yeah, you're taking down the other. You're very good at admitting the other side, and then being like, yeah, I grant that. Not that every argument.
I don't really think of it as an argument though, because I don't ever want to like say that, oh, this is the only way you can look at it. Because especially when you're writing about art, like that's just the loser's way of writing about it, to say this is the only way to do it. Like to me, the reason why people read a book like this, because again, like as I was saying before, like if you're just reading it for the information, you can get it elsewhere, or you can just listen to the record, or you can talk to your friends about it. I think the value, hopefully, for a book like this is people read it because they want to re-experience something that they love, or they want to try to understand something that they're curious about but don't know much about. And you're making them see it how you see it. And even if they don't agree with it, they think it's an interesting pair of eyes to wear for a while.
Yeah.
So to me, and I think that's probably true of any writer, really. Any writer you read, I think when I read your books, and it's different because I know you, so I feel like I understand sometimes like the person behind who's creating this, but it's like I just like the sensibility. Like you have a sensibility to your writing, and it's like, even if the stories change, like you're the narrator, I know you're there, and it's like, I just like the vibe of this. I like what he's doing here. And I think essentially that's what draws anyone to
Do you write to an audience?
Me.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, because you never know. I always feel like I don't know if anyone's going to read this, so it has to at least entertain me. And I'm always writing books that I wish someone else would write, and it's like, okay, I guess I have to write it, because it doesn't exist, so I'll do it. And it'd just be nice if someone else did it. It's a lot of work. But yeah, do you feel that way?
when I teach, I would say to my students to have an audience, like someone in mind. You know, like honestly, these two, like it's a vetting process of like, would I show this?
But isn't it just like someone like you, essentially, like someone who would
See,
have your similar sense of humor?
I think I'm different than you, where I don't like to see things that are like myself. Like I like to, like if I'm watching something, I don't want it to be about someone like me. I want it.
Well, no, but not that it's about you.
No. I know, but in fiction, I feel like that's
But
how.
someone who would have your taste in literature.
Yeah.
You know.
But I remember, like, I saw a talk with Michael Cunningham, and he said he always writes for somebody who's just a little smarter than him, you know? And it's like he tries to just be smarter than he actually is, and is always trying to just be, like, go over his own head with it. And, like, I do feel like you push the limits of what you can do that way, you know? Like yeah, I don't want to, like, see myself, but it's true. It's like, you see the Coen brothers and you see that sensibility, and you write towards that sensibility. But so I don't know if I have like an audience in mind, because as you say, like,
I mean, I guess I kind of do.
I always assume everything I write isn't going to be published.
I kind of have an audience in mind because I've written some books and I know.
Yeah, you have demographic. Like,
but still, I still feel like the old Ricky Nelson song. You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. I really do feel like that's true, because I'm the one who's going to read this book way more than anybody else. So it's like, I better enjoy this book.
That's a good,
because most people are going to read this once. Like, I'm reading this like 100 times. So if I don't, it's like, I got to have a good time.
It's true. When I got because I wrote most of the stories a while ago, and then got it published and had time to revise it. And it was like any part that I didn't like, I was like, that's out, and I'm going to fix it. And it is true. You have to read these things so much that if you don't like it, if there's any part you don't like, it's not right. Yeah.
So you're just like, this rocks. I'm great. I love this. Should we do a Q&A?
Yeah, but I do have one more question.
Oh,
I have one more question, which I meant to bring your book up for to quote it, but you have one part in there where you say that, I don't know, it's basically like the one thing that represents anything corny about Bruce Springsteen is him dancing and dancing in the dark.
Right,
you said, I have one friend
Right.
who sends GIFs of him dancing in the dark,
Right.
because you have no argument to combat that.
Well,
and
also because he knows that it annoys me.
and I want to know, is that my brother?
Yes, that's Andy. That's your brother Andy. Yes, who's had other cameos in my books, usually where he's annoying me from things he's texting me, because we do like to irritate each other. Yeah, that's definitely Andy.
Yeah, that's the best.
So,
he pulls out a Dancing in the Dark.
I don't know if he knows that. I don't know if
I told him. I took a picture of the passage.
Because I knew he was not going to read a Bruce Springsteen book, so I knew I could like slip that in without him ever detecting it.
I think he's reading the Dylan chapter.
Is he? Okay.
Yeah, because I will say, like, there's like something for everybody with yours.
Is that in that chapter?
No, but I told him to read that chapter because he loves Dylan.
Okay.
And then, I send him the parts where you're pointing out Bruce Springsteen's flaws.
Right. Great. Should we do a Q&A here? Anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
I have two questions. First of all, can both of you address your writing routine or your writing regimen? Whether it's 2 hours a day, or there are lapses, or you have a regular routine. So you can talk about that. And then also talk about, like, when you were first starting out, about the publishing process, asking for a friend.
Okay.
Me?
Yeah, you want to go first?
I'm really regimented. They're nodding their heads. I wake up, have the same breakfast, go to that.
What's the breakfast?
Smoothie, oatmeal, egg, coffee.
Wow.
Every day, when I can. Every day that I can write, I do that. I eat it in my office, and then I sometimes read, but I just kind of stopped reading before I write. And then I write, I'd say 3 to 5 hours. I try to get 500 to 1,000 words. If I'm writing, otherwise, you edit for that long, which takes me longer. Yeah, that's it. And then after, I'll eat lunch, the same lunch, and then every day, and then, kind of gets a kick out of it. And then like take care of other business, things that, actually make money, or, just like clearing the plate. Steve?
Yeah, mine's a little different because I have a daily job where I'm a writer, so I'm not just writing books ever. It's like kind of putting that in the middle of like my regular workday. But when I'm working on a chapter, I'll outline several times, you know, like what I'm gonna be doing. I'm pulling together like information that's gonna be in there, pulling together like what the thoughts are gonna be, and then when I actually do write the rough draft, it's like 9 to 1, something like that, 10 to 2. Like I just start in the morning. 4 hours is about my max that I can do before I get really tired, and then I feel awful after I write the rough draft because it's never as good as I want it to be. And then I tell myself, no one's going to read this for 2 years, and it doesn't have to be good. It just has to exist. Because once you have something that exists, then you can revise it and make it better. But just getting that initial like purge out is like the hardest part.
But I'll also say that if I don't write, I'm in a bad mood. And like my partner can tell that I'm in a bad mood. Like I'll just be grumpy and she'll be like, bad writing day? I'm like, yeah, you know, because I need to get it out. It's a very routine oriented, and that is just the way to get whatever is inside of you out, I think.
And then the quick thing about publishing, I worked in media for about a dozen years, and then an agent reached out and I said, do you want to work together? And I said, yeah. And before that, I had tried writing a couple books. Like editors from publishing houses had reached out. And if anyone in here is a writer, don't ever do that. If someone from a publisher is like, hey, I want to work with you on a book, because they will just string you along forever. There's no incentive for them to hurry or fast track that book because there's no competition. Like that's the point of having an agent. They put you on the open market, and it's capitalism at its finest. You know, it goes to the highest bidder.
So you're suggesting a literary agent rather than a publisher, is that?
Well, I mean, they're like, I mean, yeah, I would use an agent rather than go direct. I mean, most publishers are not going to just take a manuscript, but like, I had an instance where someone reached out from a publisher, and they're like, oh, let's work on an idea. And it went on for like 6 months and several drafts, and oh, it's almost there. And then I was like, this is not. And that idea actually became a book 7 years later. That was like my second book, Twilight of the Gods. But like that went through a couple different iterations. It took like 8 years for that book to get done, or to get published. So.
And literary fiction sucks to publish, and you just go through any means necessary, I think. Like, if you can get an agent, great. If you can get a publisher, great. I mean, I go through University of Wisconsin Press. My first book, I mean, it's just like whatever somebody asked me to submit, and so I submitted, and luckily got in. And then this one, I really do like them, and publishing short story collections is really, really, really hard, especially if you don't have a billion Twitter followers, or what's the social media people are using now, hip guys.
X.
X, there you go.
Elon Musk says
yes.
X.
If you don't have a built-in audience, it's really hard. If you don't have, you know, haven't won awards, whatever. But I love UW Press. Like, they're such a writer-friendly press, I think, and they've like been politically cool. They've always been cool to me, and they've refused to give me deadlines because they're like, if it's not the book you want to publish, we don't want to publish it. And I force them to give me deadlines because I need one, or I'll just still be working on this. So yeah, I went back because I liked them for the short story collection. I didn't shop it anywhere else. Not that shopping is not the right word for it, but I didn't send it anywhere else. But like, yeah, so yeah, any means necessary with literary fiction, I think.
Thank you, that was helpful.
A question for Steve. In terms of critics and like authors who write critically,
Yeah.
if you were assorting a compendium of like people who have influenced you most or who you admire most, who would be the candidates for like a Mount Rushmore of critics?
So Mount Rushmore, it's like 4 people.
For your, in that general vicinity,
Okay.
for like in terms of your
I'd say Roger Ebert would be number 1. He was the first critic I ever read, and growing up in the 80s, seeing Siskel and Ebert on TV, that's the first time I even knew that you could like talk about art for a living and make it your job. And I went to the library and I found out that he was an actual writer. So there was a series of books he put out every year called the Roger Ebert Home Companion. And it'd be a collection of his reviews, and I would just check that up in the library and read it over and over, and that's how I learned how to write reviews. So Roger Ebert, I'll say Grail Marcus, Mystery Train, The best book ever written about rock music, I think, as far as I'm concerned. I gotta say Chuck Klosterman, because when I was coming up, he was a guy that started in daily newspapers in the middle of the country, and he was somehow able to get into magazines and have a big career. And he was like 5 years older than me, and I had a similar background, and like looking at that, it was really inspirational, because back then, pre-social media, it was basically impossible to break into national media if you didn't live in New York or you didn't have connections. Got easier with the internet because you could actually mingle with people online, but before that it was impossible. And I had no hope or ambition I could even do that back then. And then I'd say Ellen Willis, who was a great writer for the Village Voice, among other places. She has a great collection of her writing called Out of the Vinyl Deeps, which I'd recommend to anyone to read. Of all those 70s music critics, she feels like the most contemporary. I actually quote her in the book. She's like, the first epigraph is an Ellen Willis quote. So I think that's it.
Who do you think you're most like?
I don't know.
I mean, which great writer are you?
Yeah, exactly. That's a weird, yeah. Alex Pickett. Yeah. Yes.
So, in your book, you talked about finding that record in your dad's glove box.
Right.
I think you talked too about how like now you're playing that for your son.
Right.
Here we are 40 years later doing that. I'm curious, are there any contemporary artists that you think will have that lifespan now that 40 years from now your son might be playing for his son? And
Yeah.
is that still going to be a thing with like albums aren't like you're not going to find an album in your glove box anymore with streaming and everything
Right.
like that?
Well, they might, because I'm gonna die one day, and there'll be like 1 million CDs that hopefully my kids will inherit and treasure, give to their kids. I don't know. I mean, it's funny with albums because people keep predicting that albums are going away, and they're not going away. Like artists, young artists, are very much centered on making albums. And I mean, like look at the biggest artist in the world, Taylor Swift. Her whole tour is the Eras tour, and it's about spotlighting each record. Like this is going to be the red part of the show. This is going to be the folklore part of the show. So she's really training people to see that. I don't know. It's like my own kids are like they're kind of into music, but like my daughter actually, who's in the house, she plays ukulele, and she knows 4 chords, which is 4 more chords than I know. So she's actually way smarter about music than I am. So I don't know. I know, like for me, like I try not to force my music on them. I don't like I play music for them all the time, but like I hear from parents sometimes, like, how can I make sure my kids have cool music taste? And I was like, they gotta find their own culture, I think, because that's what I did. Like no one ever told, like my parents didn't tell me to listen to Bruce Springsteen. I just found this tape, I thought it was cool, and I think that's when music really makes a real connection, when you find it by yourself. So
I'm also going to add, with you and having like physical media, we did on your deck last night listen to Rolling Stone's Voodoo Lounge on cassette.
yes, we did.
So, and it wasn't weird to you. You just put it in because you wanted to.
Very nonchalant, yeah, it's a great record. I almost wore a Voodoo Lounge shirt tonight. That would have been a great callback. Great tour. Yes.
Alex, want to hear your Mount Rushmore of writers? We
Oh
got-
no,
yeah.
that's no, we
Who's your
can't do
writing
that.
I'll narrow it down then, maybe short fiction writers.
Oh,
So those who write short
Yeah.
stories or novellas.
what? Joy Williams is going to be on there. William Trevor. I'm just going off the top of my head
Yeah.
of people. Donald Barthelme is up there. Man, I'm spinning.
Beverly Cleary.
Beverly Cleary, of course.
OG, man.
Yeah. Yeah, shit. If it was general writers, I'd probably be just trying to think. Mount Rushmore is just such a lofty. Flannery O'Connor, did I say Flannery O'Connor?
No.
Yeah, okay, Flannery O'Connor's got to be on there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, God.
I'm curious about
speak up so people can hear you.
Can no one hear me?
No.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Is this audible? Awesome. I'm curious about, I was going to ask a question about your peer influences, but I think I'd rather know what it was like for you doing an MFA and thinking about the culture of, I mean, I think there's always a question about publishing, and I rarely hear questions about MFAs.
It's so questions about getting an MFA and what that, how that, what aids the process or just how it
What
influences.
different-
Yeah. But I'd like you to comment on how you came up because you were very much you self-propulsive with it. But just for
Well, I went to the Ivy League of the Midwest, UW Eau Claire. It was the Harvard of Western Wisconsin.
But I think the MFA, I got to know people like you, and and we in touch, and it does get you a sense of community in a profession that is not community oriented. It can be really lonely and alienating, and you can, you need people to read your stuff. You need to feel other people's struggles, and that's like for us it was 3 years of just like going through those struggles together. And I don't know what it does for the writing. I mean, you get to talk to people who are good at it. They can read some of your work, but I think it's more drawing a line in the sand and saying like, this is what I'm doing. I'm dedicating this time. Either you come out of it and you don't never want to do it again, which probably half the people there don't, and then the other half it's just your life, and it's not about money, and it's not about fame, and it's not about material stuff. It's just doing it for the good. I mean, I think it's good. I think, we're fighting really bad things right now. There's a genocide going on. There's AI taking writers' jobs, and I think that doing something that is for the purpose of doing it's just saying something truthful and real is right. I think that's MFA. You can find like-minded people, and it's good. I think it's fine to not do it, fine to do it, but I definitely that helped. And with publishing, you get to see people who publish, and it's normal. It's like, we publish together and we do things, and so it definitely helped. I wouldn't have stuck with this writing thing this long without it, I don't think. But you really, like, I guess we already went over it, but you wrote for your local paper. You like really forced your hand on it, and that's, I think, the other way to go is
I worked for the daily newspaper back when that was a thing, and alt weeklies. Worked the railroad. Yeah, it feels so old. Some of that stuff.
But after your process, and people
It was
don't get to
great.
do it anymore.
I'm so grateful to have that experience.
Yeah.
It was great.
It doesn't exist anymore.
Writing about the Strawberry Festival in Wapaka, covering car accidents, did all that stuff back in the day. Yeah. Monster truck pulls, boy choir, Christmas concerts. Did it all. Multiple years.
One more question.
Yes.
My question is for Stephen, and I'm curious on alternate universe, what happens if Electric Nebraska is released?
Oh man, it's weird because I've been on a lot of Bruce podcasts the last few months, and we talked about the Electric Nebraska. For those who don't know, Bruce Springsteen, the album Nebraska, classic record from 1982, acoustic record, him playing into a tape recorder, very stark record. He also played those songs with the E Street Band, and that led to the release of Nebraska because it didn't really work with the band. And there's like this legendary record called Electric Nebraska. Now, are you asking like what happened if that would come out?
I'm asking like, does do we get George F. Will misunderstanding Atlantic City then?
I don't know. I mean, Bruce himself has described Born in the USA as like a kind of Electric Nebraska. And I think that there is some validity to that because those songs came out of the same period. It's just that Nebraska's acoustic and the Born in the USA songs are with the band. So I think, I think that the band definitely added a different dimension to those songs that, to me, makes them more interesting in a way. That you could have a song like Glory Days that is played every single time there's a baseball game, and people just think it's this happy-go-lucky song. But if you listen to the lyrics, Bruce talking about how pathetic it is to end up on a bar stool and talking about how great it was when you were in high school. So the opposite essentially of what the song reads as. And like, there's numerous examples of that on that record. Dancing in the Dark, another example, like this kind of self-hating song that's like dancing with Courtney Cox and at the St. Paul Civic Center in the music video. So yeah, I mean, possibly, you know, George F. Will would have messed that one up too. You know, I could definitely see that happening.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's
Are we, is that it?
Sure, if you want, we can go sell some books if you
All
want.
right.
Yes.
Well,
Go
thank
sing
you.
along if you want.
Wow. No one wants that. Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you
It's
so
been
much.
Great. Great.
Let me walk you guys up to the table. There'll be plenty of time for people to say hello.
Well, I think they did some on their reunion tour, I think. Yeah, supposedly they're just locked in the Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where
Gonna walk around a little bit and let other people do their thing.
also it's like,
Well, that answers its own question.
like I saw that like the third edition of this Alts things came out. Each one of those is huge, and it's like one of
Yeah, he's prolific. Sometimes it's good to have an heir. You know?
and yeah, it's like sometimes it's also the same.